mindfulness, knowledge from learning, understanding. Understanding through patience, insight from reflection, direction and focus from purpose, achievement through perseverance, victory, victory through achievement, knowing the source of that which you seek can be found. Life is connection, generosity from kindness and compassion, food, water, money from my hand, from my heart, peace, respect, always respect, foundation from respect, reverence and deep gratitude, humility from reverence and deep gratitude, beauty from symmetry, justice from within, knowing the source of that which we seek can be found, joy and fruition from children and grandchildren, from women, blessings, heaven and magnification from women, serenity through consciousness, balance from nature, art, and the truth. That which I seek can be found. I will return to the source. The source holds all of my provisions, legacy and protection from ancestors, example and encouragement from elders, remembrance through the unborn, culture, ordered behavior from culture, happiness from living life. Life is connection. Life, love, and power from God. Life, love, and power from God. We will meet at the place where all of our needs, all of our needs are met. Return to the source. We will recognize one another again at the source.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Warford. Today's convocation focus is hashtag for the culture. Hashtag for the culture. 400 years of Black migrations from 1619 to 2019, which mirrors the national theme in celebration of Black History Month. We are very fortunate today to have an esteemed panel of leaders whose political and academic prowess will certainly generate some robust dialogue, that I'm sure. From 1619 to 2019, and let us be mindful, as President Robinson referenced, in the last 200 years, a certain state normal college eventually grew and matured into what it is today, Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, October 3rd, 1887. There you go. Let's meet the panelists. She's a junior African-American Studies and Fine Arts minor at Florida A&M University and calls Detroit, Michigan home. Her recent projects include an examination of the Where We At collection and participated in the first ever exhibition to solely feature Black women visual artists. Please welcome multidisciplinary artist and undergraduate scholar, Ms. Daria Dockery. He's a two-time African-American Studies and U.S. History grad of FAMU and earned his doctorate degree from the University of Memphis. He specializes in the origin of HBCUs and African-American leaders during the Jim Crow era. He is the founding president of the Graduate Association of African-American History and was one of 30 scholars to serve as a fellow at Harvard University's Summer Institute on African-American Struggles for Freedom and Civil Rights. He's on the governing board of Leadership Tallahassee and is also a member of the Gamma Mu Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Please welcome Assistant Dean here at FAMU in the School of Graduate Studies and Research, Dr. Reginald K. Ellis. She became the very first African American to graduate with a PhD in history from the Department of History at UNC Greensboro. She's done extensive research on the Greensboro Massacre, honing her focus on post-civil rights activism in Black working class communities. And then she's examined the history of white supremacy from the dawn of the 1980s to the present. She has received the 2018 American Historical Association's Equity Award for her efforts to tap students and faculty from racial and ethnic groups underrepresented within historical professions. A native of Leakesville, Mississippi, she proudly serves her alma mater as Assistant Professor of History at FAMU. Please welcome Dr. Tiffany Packer. His research focuses on Black social and political movements during the 20th century. He's the author of projects on the African American political struggle and political activism in Detroit, Michigan from the 1960s through the 1980s. He's earned several awards and fellowships, including the Southern Regional Education Doctoral Scholars Fellowship and the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change Teaching Fellowship. In 2013, he was named Florida A&M University Teacher of the Year. Please welcome FAMU Associate Professor of History, Dr. Darius J. Young. He takes immense pride in being the voice, a fearless community soldier who battles for those who struggle to be heard. As a member of the Leon County Commission, he represents the people of District 1, on the south side. He led the charge to keep the beloved Bond Elementary School in the community at its current site, which is a neighbor to FAMU, and pushed for the building of the Dr. B.L. Perry Branch Public Library. Affordable housing, quality health care, education, economic development, and mental health care services are among his leadership initiatives for his constituents. A graduate of our rival Howard University and Howard University School of Law, he's been inducted into the Civil Rights Hall of Fame and has garnered awards for lifetime achievement and community service, and was also honored as a drum major for justice. Please welcome Leon County Commissioner, the Honorable Bill Proctor. Ladies and gentlemen, these are our esteemed panelists for today. Again, #ForTheCulture. I'd also like to remind you that I'm sure many of you would like to be a part of this dialogue, and you may want to ask a few questions. We have to depart close to noon, so keep that in mind. But in order for you to participate during the course of the discussion, please just raise your hand, and the communications division will provide index cards so that you can organize your thoughts and we can present them as expeditiously as possible. Also, for the panelists, again, we have to depart at noon, y'all. So, therefore, we'd like for you to be concise and try to do this in 1:30, no more than 2 minutes. Can we do that?
Yes.
Si se puede. Yes, we can. Okay. Here we go. #ForTheCulture. The theme of Black History Month centers around Black migrations. Considering that African Americans were forced to migrate to what is now the United States in 1619, how do you assess the progress of African Americans some 400 years later? What do you think our ancestors would have to say about where we are as a people? Who will jump in first?
I'll do it. Good morning, everybody. Shouts out to my family members who've come this morning, the Collins and the Proctors. Much love. I couldn't get the other family members to come. Somebody had to come. And as this audience now recognizes that all segments of my family have contributed to this quest for equality. Indeed, the Collins, the Proctors, Antonio, George, John, all of us have been in this struggle a long time. Carmen, you raise a great question, but the issue of migration is not merely geographic The issue of migration is also the migration economically upward, the migration psychologically, emotionally. How far have we migrated from who we were in 1619? Amazingly, as 20 people got off a boat in Georgetown in 1619, 6 days ago, a governor was trying to explain he was sorry that he had a black face in Virginia. 1619, 20 people got off a boat in Virginia as slaves, and slavery was instituted 400 years ago. But the other year, someone drives a car and the KKK marches through town in Virginia. In many ways, we've not migrated from where we were at the end of 1865. And I think that the migration issue, looking merely at that we move and follow the railroad tracks northerly is one aspect, but the other angle is the lack of migration from the white community moving to the center toward the 14th Amendment, the equality of all Americans, persons who are born are naturalized, who have equal protection of law and due process. So the migration point is recognizing the legal bar of who we are in the equality of citizens as Americans. And we need more people like Governor Collins, who stood the test and who lost, actually. And he told that young kid, I hope you win. But in his hope for kids like that to win, he actually lost the senatorial race because of his stance and his hopes for that young man and others. So migration has to be toward a standard of thought, and we have not reached that standard of thought perspective toward the 14th Amendment, nor have we reached that standard of thought in terms of our Judeo-Christian recognition of equality of people under God.
Please feel free. Please keep it moving. Jump in.
Okay, just to add to what Commissioner Parker talked about, keeping with the theme of migration, when the first Africans arrived in America, they arrived as unfree, from unfree to slave, from slave to 3/5 of a person, from 3/5 of a person to not a citizen, from not a citizen to a citizen quasi-free. And then as we continue to move on, there has been a thread of struggle that African Americans have faced in the United States of America since before it was the United States of America. And so even after the election of the first African American president, we still see that same thread of struggle. So I think what our ancestors would say is that as a people, we have come a long way, but now you are in a struggle to ensure that we move that much further 400 years from now. So we are on the front lines in the 21st century in our struggle, and we have to play a very, very active role to ensure that tomorrow looks better than yesterday and today.
Okay.
I see you, Doc.
All right. I'll try to be brief.
Brother, be brief.
Thank you. Again, just to piggyback off of what the other panelists said, I think it's important for us, though, to move beyond just this concept of Black history starting in 1619. And I think when we look at that question, clearly African Americans have made significant contributions and progress as a people. I'm not one of those folks who want to relay what we're going through today to what happened during the institution of slavery, because I'm very sensitive to what Black people went through during that time period. And if we really study the institution of slavery, we'll get a better sense of the atrocities that Black people faced, that it wasn't just about Black people working for free. You had sexual assault, you had all these other inhumane conditions Black people were forced to live in. If you want to learn more, Dr. Rivers literally wrote the book on slavery in Florida, and so I do challenge you all to read his book. But I think the key in that question is, what will the ancestors think? And beyond just thinking about it in the concept of where we are and how we can continue to fight, I think the challenge is for Black people to push themselves to understand that Black history does not start in 1619. What our ancestors may be disappointed with is that Black people are working and fighting so hard to move away from their African ancestry, and this is an opportunity for us to reclaim it, right? So it's not about us just progressing in American society, it's about us connecting to the totality of the Black experience and connecting with the African diaspora and understanding that all Black people have went through significant issues, struggles, trials and tribulations, but to connect with that and reclaim our ancestry and reclaim our heritage and culture as African people before we can continue to move forward and progress as African Americans today.
Next question. Dr. Tiffany, get ready. Tuesday evening, in a delayed address before a sharply divided Congress, the nation's president further outlined his plans regarding immigrants. Should African Americans be concerned? Should you be concerned with the anti-immigrant sentiment that is still unfolding before our eyes in the United States today? This sentiment is punctuated with cries for building a medieval wall, separating children from parents, and increased stereotyping, some would say, of all non-European immigrants, often portrayed by some as rapists, murderers, and drug dealers. If so, how should we respond to this situation?
Well, the easy answer and very quick answer is absolutely yes. Black people should be concerned about this, right? And when I think about the role of African Americans in terms of how they should respond to this type of thing or what their positions should be, let me say, I don't necessarily think that African Americans themselves should be concerned with being sent back elsewhere, right, ourselves. But other black communities are not necessarily protected, particularly if we're talking about those that are coming from island communities, those that might be coming directly from the continent that have been here, right? Nobody is particularly safe. But I will say this, is that if black people here in America want to be understood as the godmothers and godfathers of the movement, which we should be, right, then with that comes a level of obligation and responsibility, which is that once you knock down or knock open the door, then you have an obligation and responsibility to hold it open, right? So therefore, we have a role in pushing back against this type of oppression and discrimination. Further, I always like to encourage my students to be careful about the ways in which you engage particular conversations, if we can be real about this thing. The way that the government talks to Mexicans, right? This idea of them being rapists, being other violent aggressors, those are the same types of descriptions that they placed on black people, right, for our own identities. And so even in my American history course, we've even been talking about how, you know, black people were faced with that type of crisis, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, now we're talking about Mexican people. So what's the lesson? The lesson is that if it's not you today, it's probably gonna be you tomorrow, right? Which means that we all have a collective role, and black people should be leading that because we know what that looks like and what that feels like. Now, in terms of how we can respond to that in real terms on the ground, is just simply, I mean, of course, in addition to being a part of the political process, so on and so forth, it's just simply how you treat people, right? Understanding people as human beings and not assuming that they're there to rape you or to be a violent aggressor, because that's the same type of stuff that black men have to deal with when they go to the supermarket. Right, in terms of how people automatically categorize you, right? So I think one of the things that we can do in our everyday lives is just extending a friendly and welcoming hand to those who may be different, right? To say that everybody is not standing behind what the government is trying to propel and propose.
Thank you, Dr. Tiffany. Bennett College, one of only 2 all-female HBCUs, was in very serious trouble with SACS and could have lost its accreditation if the institution did not raise $5 million just the other day by the end of January. Should African Americans feel any sense of obligation to assist HBCUs like Bennett or others who are in dire financial straits? Or should we just let those institutions that are not doing well right now go ahead and close permanently? Ms. Daria.
Well, I think that there is an obligation to protect them because of the history. The history of Black people is in our institutions and what we make. So, yes.
Yeah, and I mean, that is the simple question. I mean, the simple answer is yes, we do have a responsibility as African Americans to protect HBCUs. HBCUs are central to Black progress in this country. It's at the center of Black progress. When we look at these various movements that happen, it's largely directly related to African Americans not only attending but graduating from colleges, earning money, earning status, things of that nature that led to some of the boundaries being broken down throughout the 20th century. So Black people as a whole benefit from HBCUs, and we do have a collective responsibility for each other. It's fine for us to debate Howard and FAMU, who's going to play this week, and bands and things of that nature.
It won't be much competition, y'all, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Understand that we're a part of that collective. I think it's also, though, an opportunity for HBCUs. When we look at it in the late 19th and early 20th century, HBCUs weren't just the institutions that housed the Black intelligentsia. They were the center of the Black community. So whether or not you went to FAMU or you went to Howard, or if you went to Bennett, individuals around that community looked at that institution as a place of inspiration. That's where you went for your entertainment. It was no separation between the university and the Black community. So if African Americans, as you stated in your question, have a responsibility, we as HBCUs have a responsibility to reconnect with that experience so that we're not just relying on alum to give back, and that we are fully involved and immersed in that Black experience once again.
Commissioner Proctor, Kamala Harris, a graduate of an HBCU, I think it was Howard University, has announced that she's going to run for President of the United States in 2020. How do you feel about the role that HBCUs have in shaping tomorrow's leaders in that regard, so that they will be prepared to lead the nation, possibly in the future, as an elected official yourself?
Well, Howard University did a lot to shape me. I'm an example of what an HBCU can do. We all saw Mayor Gillum, his stance. We saw him on CNN, what he represents as one HBCU son. And all of us who have derived the benefits, the glory, the development, the empowerment of an HBCU experience, we carry its set of values. We carry its interpretations of sociology. We embody its spirit of understanding that an HBCU is an instrument that is undoing the yoke of bondage. And when you receive the progeny of the Negro mother, or the progeny of the Negro grandmother and grandfather in an HBCU, it recognizes the scars, it recognizes the first generation, it recognizes and is culturally competent to mold this clay into a finished product that glistens, that just shines and sparkles in its humanity, in its intellect, in its spirit, and it always comes out as an American product. The question was raised, I think Dr. Rivers, W.B. Du Bois talked about the duality of being American and being Black. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that the HBCU does, it tends to reconcile that duality, perhaps more than any other instrument of which a Black person will receive. They certainly won't get it in the United States military, in other institutions and pathways, but in the HBCU, there is a reconciliation of the duality and then a consolidation of the total person that goes into society to provide a great work, to make contributions for all of America. Coming back to your question, Kamala Harris is going to make a fantastic president, and we're going to give her that chance to show you what the HBCU can bring.
Thank you, Commissioner. as we put a comma right there on the relevance of HBCUs, what do you think the level of commitment should be from the community? I say that, I preface that with, throughout the last quarter of the 20th century and continuing today, the crisis in black education has grown significantly in urban neighborhoods where public schools lack resources, endure overcrowding, exhibit a racial achievement gap, and often confront policies that fail to deliver substantive opportunities. The benefits of education remain elusive to many blacks of all ages, and tragically, some poorly performing schools serve as pipelines, some have said, to prison and for youth. So how can this HBU and others, and African Americans in our communities, respond? How should they respond to the crisis in black education today?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the first two questions. First of all, I think we have to go back to 1865 and look at the two institutions that African Americans fought for and gained access and control of, which was the black church and black education. If black people in America fought for black education like they fight for the black church, we will be in great position today as it relates to K-12 education. So when we look at 1881 to 1887, when this institution was founded, it was founded as the State Normal and Industrial School for Negroes. The normal part stands for teaching teachers. So these individuals would return into the black community to train black children so they could migrate from one social economic status to the next. And so we have to get back to that landmark, training black teachers to go into black schools so they can see a teacher before they, a teacher that looks like them, walks like them, talks like them, before they get to a college. And for the first time in their lives, they see an African-American male or African-American female who's teaching in the STEM area, who is teaching history, or who is teaching anything, or an administrator who looks like them, walks like them, talks like them, who can guide them and say, no, you don't need to be taking 3 electives when you need to be taking math, English, and sciences. So these are the type of things that HBCUs need to be really focusing on and looking at in the 21st century, because when you go back to 1865, one of the former slaves, Charles Whiteside, was told by a slave owner that you have no freedom because you have no education, and education is what makes the man free. And still to the 21st century today, education is what truly makes you free.
If I may add to that, kind of piggyback off of what Dr. Ellis said, and kind of to backtrack to another part of your question earlier about the role of HBCUs. You know, I've heard a lot of students say that they have had to justify why they would want to come to FAMU or any HBCU for that matter, right? People say, look, that is not the real world, okay? When you get out there, it is not going to be black people that you are mostly surrounded by, so why not go somewhere where it's going to be a reality for you once you leave your college life, right? And so one of the things, or one of the ways I like to respond to that is by saying is that HBCUs, I know my experience here at FAMU, I was able to experience something that I know I would not have experienced somewhere else, right? Which is the sort of education that I was getting, right? Being culturally immersed in a way that I had never been before, being exposed to certain types of representation, so many people that were educating me that looked like me. And you're absolutely right. When I left, as you stated in my introduction, I mean, even when I went to grad school, not only was I the only person there that of color, but I didn't have any professors that were of color. But you know how I knew I could make it? Because of the institution that I had come from and the representation that had taught me. So I knew that I had an obligation, right, to follow through and be that leadership and that representation for community. So for your direct question, right, I think that HBCUs have a continued commitment to this idea of representation, not only in education, but through any professional platform, so that when we go back into communities of color, as Dr. Ellis said, they can say that, yes, they do look like me, and yes, I can do and be that too, right? I think in our everyday walks of life, our responsibility too is through community service. It's just no way around that, right? We have, the community has an obligation to us, but we also have an obligation to the community by showing up in ways that the community may need it.
Ms. Daria, you're a junior here, up and coming to graduate someday very soon.
Very soon.
And yes. And so, as you consider the relevance of HBCUs and their preparation to prepare you, should there be a greater obligation? Should we turn more of our focus toward preparing you for the global stage? And do you feel that HBCUs can do that in this climate?
I think the focus in general should be on mentorship and care, and taking care of each other, teaching each other what we need to go out into society, and not act off of our identities. And just our what we hold inside of us, really looking at a situation and discerning things. That's what I have learned here at this HBCU. I walk out of the world, into the world every day, and I am studying things. I'm looking deeper into every concept I encounter to see what is there, because I know that something else is there. That's the relevance of an HBCU to me. Just teaching us to be more discerning, to be more caring, to take care of each other.
All right. Let me say this about Ms. Dockery as well. All right. So Daria last summer studied at the Schomburg, which is the leading museum for Black history in New York, Harlem, New York. And she was one of few HBCU representatives who went and qualified and was accepted in a program which essentially trains individuals and prepares them for doctoral programs, all right? The reason that I'm not gonna say the reason she's qualified, but we also had a previous Schomburg recipient, fellowship recipient, Jermaine Scott, who's now finishing up his PhD in history or in African American studies at Northwestern, who's a product of that program but sits on that board, and he makes it a priority to make sure that we have representation from FAMU in that cohort. Those individuals have access to the leading professors across the nation, and these individuals are engaged at their universities at Harvard, all the Ivy Leagues, private colleges, but they are knocking down our doors, emailing us to send more students from FAMU, because when they go up there, they're more prepared than the individuals that they train at their own institutions because of the mentorship that she's speaking of, right? And so when we talk about the relevancy of HBCUs, we have to keep in mind the focus, right? That HBCUs have always been about giving opportunities to individuals who may be overlooked by majority institutions. That's the story of American education, right? At the end of the day, higher education was only supposed to be relegated to the elite, black or white, right? Poor whites, poor blacks were not supposed to have access to higher education. So we've always sought to fill that void and to provide those opportunities for African Americans. One of my former professors, the late Ted Hemingway, used to tell us every day that the students at HBCUs are the best taught students in America, because you have a chance to learn from your professors, be taught by your professors, essays, everything graded, feedback, but also the mentorship piece, which separates the black experience, the black college experience, from most institutions across America. So as long as we're still providing that service, as long as we still have problems within our community that black colleges should be looking to solve, we are more relevant today than we have been through any point of our history.
Wow. Hashtag for the culture, 400 years of Black history. The demographics of the United States are increasingly becoming more representative of a racially and culturally diverse population. With that demographic shift, how should the minority community, African Americans, evaluate the election of the nation's president in November of 2016? Commissioner Proctor.
Well, the election of 2016 goes back to a flawed constitution that creates and established the electoral college system. The electoral college system actually lied on, betrayed the majority which Hillary Clinton had by 3 million votes. And when there's that conflict that the majority of the people's voices are quelled, denied, then there is a problem functionally, foundationally. And I see the problem as the constitutional need for reassessment, that the majority of the people, their votes will carry the day in a presidential election. Short of that remedy and retrofitting our U.S. Constitution to eliminate electoral college, the likelihood that the 2020 election will bring the same result, where the person receiving the least amount of votes will likely win again, to me is a strong probable.
So then, how do you come to terms with the perception, based on what you just said, in some communities about whether there's a need to go to the polls? What about the GOTV effort, the Get Out the Vote effort?
Well,
and where does this institution and other institutions, where do they fit in, especially with our students, not only in the 2020 elections, but beyond, when you're still grappling with some of the very issues that you just underscored?
Well, the likelihood that the people that went out to vote in Georgia, when the referee is also the opponent of the female gubernatorial candidate who's representing the Democrats, what faith can citizens who are fragile in their belief anyway, history and the legacy of voting has not wrought well in terms of their hopes, expectations for winners on election day, I expect Georgia to have a diminished turnout. Alabama, however, came out and people were voting 25 strong, and they defeated that crazy guy that was running for, I believe, U.S. Senate. And then here in Florida, all of Gillum's votes didn't get counted. And how do you expect people to continue to believe in a process fraught with incidents where whose votes count often reflects what party in that demographic represents? So the last election of 2018 does not bode well for faith or confidence in the electoral process based on Florida, based on Georgia, and maybe Alabama, of all places, gives us faith.
I think, too, we have to do a better job of educating people on the importance of voting, right? I think that's at the heart of your question, is that we have individuals today who are disillusioned with the process, who feel that we've gotten to a point where we don't have to go out and vote. You have individuals who actively, from entertainers, other high-profile individuals who say they don't believe in the system, therefore we shouldn't vote. If you don't believe in this one candidate, that you should not participate in the electoral process. But when I look at these movements throughout the late 19th, the early 20th century, I see throughout that period whites who will do anything to strip black people from their political power. So if they're willing, and whenever we see any type of black progress through the ballot, it's often met with some sort of extremist violent response from the white community. So if your vote doesn't mean anything, why are people reacting that way once you not only participate, but are successful in the political process? When we think about the election of Barack Obama, for black people, some of us said that was the epitome You have individuals talking about post-racial societies and things of that nature. Black people showed up to the polls, they voted, and we celebrated for those 8 years. But what we didn't know is that it woke up another segment of the community who saw black people progressing, who saw African Americans attaining the highest position in this nation, and we see the result of it today. So we're not at a position where we can just disregard the vote. The vote is central to the black experience. In order to protect ourselves, it's not about voting for an individual. The vote is not an end-all, cure-all for everything. The black political process operates both in formal and informal ways. So we got to go out and vote, but also play a role in our community, understanding that it's not going to be a top-down approach. It's got to be a bottom-up approach. So we can't just leave
I want to
that.
just weigh in after Dr. Young has, and that is that there's been migration. I want to finish Carmen's question.
Yeah.
And the migratory pattern of young people to technology and how you reach them. And if Dr. Larry Rivers, the preeminent scholar of history in Florida, stood right here right now and said, vote this and vote that and the impact. But if Rivers ain't talking to these folk on one of them things, that right there, they ain't even paying him no mind. See? So
Yeah.
the migration to technology has left almost faithless people who hear a message coming from just mortal beings. It has to come from a mortal, but entered through a device, and then, social media said, yeah, hashtag this, and then it's good. And then the migratory pattern of making America great again, and people are migrating backwards to them good old days. And when you take that migration, we're talking about intellectual, we're talking about a mental, we're talking about a space and place interpretation of what America is and who it's for. When you migrate in that direction, you're going to bump into Governor Leroy Collins, who was migrating in an upward norm that saw everybody as having an opportunity. Now, in that pattern, there were governors who stood in the doorways. Farbers went down to the Central High School. Wallace went down to Alabama, stood up in the doorway. Maddox was crazy as hell. You know, we got crazy folk sitting there saying who can't get an opportunity, who can't get into America's middle class, that you can't become a pharmacist. And the relevance of Florida A&M is that out of 129 pharmacy schools in America, 60% come from this school. Is that relevant? You don't have to argue about the productivity. What we're talking about is first and foremost when a student come out of an HBCU, they ready to go to Schaumburg, they go anywhere. But the first need for a student to do is conform. And then you got to sit there and learn a couple things, and then you got to have the daring. And then you got to have the daring to take the risk to move in a direction that doesn't leave you just working for someone else all the time. You don't do that. And you got to have the courage. And one of the things, hopefully, that we see that that confidence is born in a majority experience. Hell, that's the value of the HBCU. You don't know that? That's what you get. Confidence. And confidence is 60% of what you do in life. You ain't got it. You can know a lot from up here, but if you ain't got it from here, it ain't gonna make no application.
May I add to that,
Yes,
just
Dr.
very quickly, back to how would you respond to students or young people that might be feeling dismayed about the whole voting process, right? To kind of carry on with what Dr. Young was saying earlier, when we look at the historical patterns, anytime that there are perceived notions of progress, you also have an upsurge in resistance to that, right? So, for example, you start talking about freedom that comes in 1865, you have the formation of the Klan, right? You see the election of President Obama, then the threat on president's life went up like 200%, right? So you know that you're going to get that pushback. But one of the things that we can learn from the ancestors, right, is that no matter what type of pushback that you get, you still have an obligation to do your part. Right? And the other thing that we must learn too, when studying Black freedom struggles, is that we have to be patient. These things happen as a result of a push over time. You know, we're in a generation where people want that instant gratification, but when you start talking about freedom struggles, you have to be committed to that from the beginning to the end, right? And so, you know, the power of social media, internet, you know, Commissioner Proctor is absolutely right. Everybody is so digital, but I think that that is something that can work in our favor, because one of the things that's also historically true is that America tends to make change whenever they are internationally embarrassed. Okay? And so with access to things like social media, we have the tools to continue to put America on blast in a way that hadn't really been done before, right? So our job is to, no matter how much your knees buckle, you have to keep them tight and stay in the fight and know that whatever you are contributing is going to add to the Black freedom struggle that always continues.
Thank you. Hashtag for the culture, 400 years of Black migrations. There's been a constant uptick in racial violence against minorities, some would say, since the nation's president was elected. How should African Americans prepare, Dr. Tiffany, and respond to this alarming situation, as a footnote to your comments?
Well, a couple of things. One is, as I just stated, making sure that you are remaining a part of the process, right? Whatever that process means, if that's being politically involved. And let me be very clear about that. Politics does not always mean in the traditional sense in terms of the ballot. Of course you should be doing that, right? But other political things as well, if that is showing up for discussions, if that's showing up for protests, if that's doing writings, right? If that's being a steward over people of color stories, right? To make sure that they're maintained. All of those things are political moves that are necessary, right? I think that that's primarily how we should be responding to this type of thing. Could you repeat the question for me one more time? Because it was something.
How should African Americans prepare and respond to this alarming situation relative to the trend or upward movement of the needle in racial violence against minorities in the U.S.?
This is the second part I was going to say, which is to be present. To be present. When I'm teaching upper level African American courses, I like to start with an article that was written by a professor in Philadelphia when he said that he was stopped. After his class, he walked across the street to get some lunch, right? And when he was walking across the street, he was stopped and held up by some police officers who said that he fit a description of somebody who had just committed a robbery. And so they were asking who he was, where he was going, who did he think he was, and all of this kind of stuff, no matter the fact that he had his ID badge on, right? And so in this article, he was saying that how it didn't matter in that moment that he was a PhD and a professor and people loved him. In that moment, he was relegated to feeling like he was not a human being. But one of the things that he said that was super powerful in that article, and the reason why I use it, is he said that there was an older Black lady who was a little bit down the block, and she was paying attention to what was happening, right? And she just stood there and watched until the police got finished. And eventually the police, they figured out that he wasn't who they were looking for, and they apologized and all of this. So he made it his business to go up to her and say, "Thank you for not leaving. Thank you for not leaving," right? Because he felt like her presence alone was enough to put this police behavior on blast, right? That made the police think a second time before maybe doing something to him that was inhumane. So I think that a part of our role is to pay attention and be present. If you see something that you think doesn't look right, or you're not sure how that's going to go, we need to be present and pay attention to that so that we can show a level of support just in our everyday life and function, right? When we're talking about Black men, women, and children, for sure.
Hashtag for the culture. Vernon Bryant, I see you back there, and I think Miss Sabrina is also in the house. Do we have index cards that we can start moving forward? We'd like to hear what you all think about some of Attorney Dew. If you could, As Attorney Dew is coming toward the microphone, Sabrina and Vernon, if you could bring those cards down, and we can do this expeditiously.
My question to you is why we use the word migration? African Americans did not come here voluntarily. They were stolen. My question to you, as many of us who are now getting older, whether or not we can maintain the history of exactly what has occurred in relation to the slave trade, how so many Africans were stolen and brought material wealth to America, not as immigrants, but as slaves. And as we get older, is history going to be rewritten in another way? I was brought up in Terre Haute, Indiana, with no history of slavery, but it has its own problems. And when we got involved in the civil rights movement, a history professor from FAMU, who was a graduate student at IU, encouraged me to come to FAMU Law School. And when I saw a picture of Patricia Stevens in Jet magazine,
Watch out.
you know the rest of the story.
Watch out.
Now, but what I'm concerned about is how can we begin to involve more people in developing what has been the history of the freedom movement here in North Florida and Tallahassee. For example, European Americans like the Owsley family, Lewis State Bank, the Lewises. I hope next year, Dr. Rivers, we're going to involve more people in the development of what the history has really been. That way we can develop the truth as it ought to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Dew. With regard to economics and 400 years of history, especially the last 10 years, how do we as a people move forward? Who wants to jump in? Dr. Ellis?
Can you restate the question again? I'm sorry.
The question was, there's no name, relative to economics and the impact of economics, where we are as a people in that regard, how we've been impacted the last 400, 250, 10 years, and how do we as a people move forward?
I think we have to go back to a concept of a community as it relates to economics. So when we look at community, I go back to the concept of HBCU. So when Bennett was in their trouble for about a month, they had this hashtag, Stand With Bennett, and there was an amazing outpouring of support to make sure that that institution remained open. Now, it was sad that it took for that school to almost lose accreditation for African Americans to stand with Bennett. I think that moving forward, we should stand with HBCUs, we should stand with black-owned businesses, we should stand with black churches, we should stand with black teachers, we should stand with the community economically and put our money where our mouth is. So we can't go and cry when Bennett is closing or when Bethune-Cookman is struggling or when FAMU is struggling financially, when we sit back and say, oh, I'm gonna go and watch this football game at big university across the street and enjoy the fine dining over there when FAMU.
When Florida A&M University needs you to be in Bragg, is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Dr. Reggie. Here's a particular question. The Honorable, I think you can handle this one. What are some initiatives you would propose, and this is also to the other panelists as well, to improve infrastructure of Tallahassee's South Side?
Thank you. The first thing,
You had a plan out there, Commissioner Proctor.
the first thing that we shouldn't do is allow for one of those statements that Dr. Young mentioned earlier about separating our HBCUs from their communities. When you go to Howard, it's surrounded by its community. Morehouse and Spelman surrounded by their community. FAMU is surrounded by Bond, South City, J. Gaither Park by its community. And you certainly symbolically would not build a major $60 million police headquarters and stick it between Florida A&M University and South City community. The symbolic divide between the haves of education and the have-nots of education. Our elite class of people here at FAMU being divided by a $60 million wall. And I believe that that $60 million ought to be the down payment for many of the needs that would provide simple things like sidewalks that are needed on Barberville Drive, that are needed on Young Street. There's no sidewalk on Osceola. We only about 4 years ago got a sidewalk on Palmer. And when you go to Florida State University, you see sidewalks leading to their administration building, TCC. And again, how do you migrate in your sight and perception of needs and calibrate an understanding that people who come to FAMU from around the world have need for parking spaces, lights, and all of that. It's missing all around. And maybe the role of Florida A&M is to be an advocate for these things. But certainly one of the big questions now in terms of that wall and what one of the panelists mentioned about feeling secure with police. I think the majority of people don't feel secure with police. And I think it would be a huge mistake if, in terms of infrastructure, that the best that the city can identify for the South Side is to put the most expensive public building ever that would ever rest here as a police headquarters, as a statement of military occupation, and nothing comes with it other than that, the raw power, the dogs, the batons, the tasers, and standing between FAMU and South City. That would be tragic. It likely would follow when the city promised, and it disrupted a community from Dewey Street back to Martin Luther King, depleted that black neighborhood, built a deep pond, put water there, and now you see it gentrified. And the city itself built the biggest building down there, and what has followed has been white gentrification. The city is going to build another big building here if it goes through, and likely what will follow is from the same playbook, gentrification. I hope that FAMU will stand up and oppose that. There is no history in Tallahassee that shows from the past that the city's effort to build and be the lead investor, it has always led to more white takeover and black loss of land. That's the history, and I hope FAMU will pay attention at this time.
What is your impression of the state of Black America? You talked about law enforcement. Just trying to gain your perception about the relationship with law enforcement and the overall criminal justice system. Many say that the Black Lives Matter campaign was born with FAMU graduates. Is it still relevant in your opinion?
Absolutely. Every day we arise and we take a breath. We each want to do the same thing, black, white, any color. We want to keep breathing and get to the end of the day and face another one. So to the extent that there's hostility, the statement that Black Lives Matter has to be stated in 2019, it speaks to the stagnation of the mindset of white supremacy, to not allow, to not tolerate, to not open doors, to not open hearts, to not open opportunities, and then to utilize its instruments of policing as oppressive arms to keep people in their places, to over-police. What's this thing about open container? So if you're within 100 feet of the front door where you bought a can of beer, And if you're within 100 feet, you get arrested for opening the can. But now if you bought some bubble gum or some snuff or some tobacco, you can just open it right there before you get out the store. But how many people who go to jail in Tallahassee for open container violations are black, and how many are white? And when you look at the application of policing, and you look at the numbers, I asked the judge this morning, the breakfast meeting I was at, I said, Judge, what's the state of the courts? Are they still about 80% black? He said, yep, about 80%. I work in the courthouse. I've been elected 22 years. My office is on the 5th floor of the courthouse. I know when it's court day. You just know it by all the black people who are there. And the courts are running 85 to 90% black on court day as criminal defendants all the time. It's a big problem. I hope that our university could look more at the demographics of what's occurring and how we might fix some of these things.
Dr. Young, this question is for you. Where does Black history begin? How do we include more information about its beginning in everyday life?
Well, I think that's a great question. Black history begins with the first man that walked this planet. I mean, Black history goes back thousands of years. And so it's not a 400-year since 1619 discussion. In order for us to move beyond that, though, we have to challenge ourselves intellectually to go back and connect with that past, that we have individuals here who are teaching courses on African history, right, where we can really look at the link between what was happening in West Africa, where most of the black people here ancestry dates back to, and prompted whites and Europeans to engage in trade, which ultimately led to the experiences that happen here in the Western Hemisphere. It's going to be us challenging each other to go back and learn that past, right? So in my intro class, I realized that the majority of those students aren't history majors, aren't going to major in history. And I'm conscious of that in terms of the way that I approach it, because I understand, unfortunately, the way the American education system is set up, that this will be the only black history class that they will ever take in their entire lives. So one of the challenges that I give to my students is to understand, to connect to the humanity of it. Don't just take notes in order to pass a class, because it's going to be important for you to tell those stories to your kids as they're coming up, right? So when they come to college, that this information isn't completely foreign. Everybody else does an incredible job of connecting their experiences today to their ancestors' experience, except for us, all right? So we have to challenge ourselves. We have to take that burden on our own backs. Professors at the university who have the opportunity to teach students about their past beyond us starting with slavery, where we talk about the empires, when we talk about the kingdoms, when we talk about pyramids and being the first civilization, West African religion and culture, that it doesn't become something that was introduced to us as ignorant, uncivilized, barbaric slaves, the way that most of us think have been taught about black history in the past. So we have to connect with that experience. We have to understand that that is not something foreign to us. One of the great tragedies of the slave trade is that unfortunately black people can't look to just Ghana, Nigeria, and these different countries as a place of origin. So we do have to look to that continent as our place of origin, and also understand that we have to fight beyond this perception of Africa being whatever it is that, you know, is discussed today. That we control the narrative of West Africa, that we honor our ancestors by connecting to that past, and that we take all opportunities to learn about the different experiences of black people throughout the diaspora.
Ms. Darian, from a student perspective, how important is it that this HBCU and others began to shift the attitude of the black campus and the black campus life, and that it become more open and accepting of many subgroups within our culture?
Were they specific about what subgroups they meant, or no?
But what do you think about, do you think there's a need to change the attitude? What is your impression of the Black campus culture attitude?
I think that when you have people of, like when you have Black people on a campus, we are not all the same. We all have different ideas, we're inspired by different things, we're coming here to like pursue different interests, we have different goals. And so we should all be engaging with each other and being open with each other about what we're here for and what we want. Some of us are here to like pursue economic goals and like capitalistic goals. Some of us are here to like change the world and like be revolutionary. But we have to listen to each other, work together, keep our campus clean, like take care of each other to do anything at all. It's about the people, and it's about us.
Thank you, Ms. Daria. I really want to try to get these last few questions in, if we can. There's a question about examples of institutional racism against African Americans and what can be done to abolish this. Dr. Ellis?
Okay, I keep coming back to higher education, but if you look at funding models, I think that's an example of institutional racism across the United States of America. When you look at K-12 education and higher education, I think how we can abolish that goes back to the earlier question about voting. You might not be able to get individuals elected that will change educational boards or boards of governors or boards of regents in one election. It takes, as Dr. Packer said earlier, it takes a long time. But I think that as students at HBCUs, we have to look at what directly impacts us and what directly impacts our economics, what directly impacts our social status in America, and look at how individuals are doing things legally to stop our growth. And then you will see institutional racism in that. Then you should figure out ways to get around those type things. And so for me, it's looking at what's going on in higher education and figuring out how to get around that.
On the environment, what about the environmental issues like many chemicals strictly directed toward minorities? How do we achieve and launch our activism with regard to the Black community relative to protecting the environment?
I think Dr. Larry Robinson should take that question and guide us, Mr. President, on the ecological racism of America and the great work that the FAMU Center on Ecology has been looking at over the years. And that is pinpointing, identifying the placement of NIMBYs, not in my backyard, elements such as waste treatment facilities, where the noise in the airport is located, the garbage transfer center, all the things that generally you don't want on your side of town, you place it in the other side of town, where the railroad tracks come through, the toxic chemicals on the railroad cars that flow right down there by FAMU all the time, the open ditches and all the polluted water that comes right by FAMU and the big holding. Yeah, and all of that. That's why I wanted Dr. Robinson to handle this question. But he looked at me and winked, and I thought that meant that I was just to go ahead and, you know, just take a stab. All right.
As we approach the conclusion of the summit today, hashtag for the culture, 400 years of Black migrations, Black history. Many of you are professors of history. What do you think it would do for the Black community if more courses relative to Black history were taught as requirements rather than electives, regardless of your major?
Well, I mean, it would be great if we could offer Black history courses to everyone and everybody was mandated, I guess. But there are some infrastructural issues, and we do need you all to graduate in 4 years, Dr. Robinson. So, but again, I think really, and this is going back to my time at FAMU, it wasn't just about what we learned in class, that there are plenty of opportunities to learn outside of class, that you have many opportunities like this that you could take advantage of to come out and to learn more about our history. We have programs that we do. Myself and Dr. Ellis are co-directors of the Center for Social and Political Change, where we're going to have publications and other events centered around educating the community about issues pertinent to the Black experience. So the benefit of being at a HBCU is that you have plenty of opportunities to learn. Today and tomorrow, as a shameless plug, the Southern Conference of African American Studies will be on campus for a few events, but also we're having a conference at the Doubletree, and students are welcome to attend at no cost. So there are opportunities that you have to take advantage of. You have to be conscious of some of the programming that already exists, that it doesn't always have to be in a formal classroom setting. And just to be honest, oftentimes the best discussions and the best opportunities to learn is outside of a classroom, where you don't have the stresses and all these other distractions, and that most people who are in there are like-minded, and we can get to the root of some real issues. So those opportunities exist without accumulating additional course hours and things of that nature, because we do need you to graduate in 4. All right.
And with that, of course, we know this dialogue could go all day long, but we don't have the time. And so we'd like to thank Dr. David Jackson, Jr., who is serving as chair of this committee. Thank you. And a special thank you as well to Dr. Larry Rivers for being a part of this wonderful effort. To our president, Dr. Larry Robinson, as well, thank you for your energy in support of the cause. And to our outstanding panelists, Daring, Daria, I appreciate the fact that you came up here and sat flat-footed with your boots on, and you handled it. And we wish you well, because the students are the you in FAMU.
That's right.
We thank you, students. We thank you to our panelists, and we hope that the intriguing conversation here today will compel all of you to go out beyond the confines of these walls and have a conversation. Mommy, thank you for coming out. You're a graduate as well. I love you. Thank you, Rattlers and friends. God bless you. Have a great day.
Yes.
Good job.